she blows in and out like a wind.
That's it. Well, that's what the answer is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't Nancy going? There are a few sailors in the room when I said ticky-tacky.
Yeah, she has a.
You guys are good to go whenever it's recording. So.
Well, what time is it?
It is
Oh, it's time.
this afternoon.
Yeah, so let me close the door.
Otherwise we feel like we're in level 3 atrium. The door open.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for coming again.
Thanks for coming back, yes!
I can't believe it. They're coming back.
They came back, oh
You guys weren't so bad after all.
my! We did lose a few.
Or maybe they're saying, well, maybe it'll be better. Yeah, we should give it one more try.
Give it one more try.
One more try, okay.
Come in. Come
Basse,
in.
come!
Come. Just open the door.
Is it locked maybe?
Oh, maybe it's locked.
It's locked, no wonder you kids come in. I just unlocked it.
Okay, just come in close. Pull over a chair.
Chamomile.
Go for
Okay,
it.
well, just to be honest, when I saw that today was about Palm Sunday, my first reaction was, I mean, okay, so Palm Sunday is important. It commemorates the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem, which is no small deal. But the church, historically, the celebration is pretty uncontroversial. It's been around for a while. There aren't these weird merges and divisions and changes that there were with Ash Wednesday or even Lent itself. And so special ceremonies were taking place toward the end of the 4th century in Jerusalem, by the end of the 8th century in Europe. During the Middle Ages, ceremonies got extremely elaborate and were often citywide, going from one church to another. The palms being blessed at another church, and you carried it to yet another church, and the liturgy got more and more elaborate, and this sort of wound down after a while. But then I started thinking about the actual entry into Jerusalem at the time, and what the significance of that was, and what the impression of it might have been. And I was just galvanized. This is a really crucial moment in our understanding of what's going on. Though there are different ways to interpret it. Nevertheless, the most interesting thing, okay, so Jesus comes in, and it's called, his triumphal entry. Well, he comes in on a donkey. And not just any donkey, it's a nursing donkey. And he comes in with a bunch of ragtag followers from Galilee, which is not exactly the height of sophistication and scholarship, or even history, for that matter. And people throw their cloaks down so he doesn't get dusty. And triumphant entry. This does not look like a triumphant entry. If you wanted a triumphant entry, you'd go to the other end of town, where people had seen Roman triumphs. Now, those were triumphant entries. Horses and armor and banners and hundreds of people. It was extremely elaborate and intended to emphasize might, power, and the triumph of might and power. Well, even the most optimistic follower of Jesus could not help but notice that there was a difference between Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and a true triumphant entry into Jerusalem, especially in those days. But Jerusalem, Palestine was under Roman rule. Palestine and Jerusalem had probably reached the height of wealth and sophistication, elaborate architecture. The temple became even more elaborate and enriched than it ever had been under Herod, who I'll get back to in a minute. But he comes in on a donkey. Now, a donkey's a peaceful animal. I mean, unless you're Cervantes, you don't have people going off on donkeys to conquer the world. No. And the palm branches, yeah, they're a symbol of victory in some cultures and a symbol of eternal life in other cultures. In the Greco-Roman culture of the Roman Empire, which was very influential on Christian tradition, the palm branch was a symbol of triumph and victory. So for contemporary Roman observers, the procession would have evoked the Roman triumph when he's called the triumphator, the general who was being acknowledged, laid down his arms and wore the toga, which would be the civilian dress of peace, with emblems of the palm on it. In ancient Egypt, also influential, the palm was carried in funeral processions and represented eternal life. So you have these multiple meanings for the palms. But the absence of real panoply and elaborate triumph isn't there. Now, we can see ultimately that it is a triumphal entry, but certainly it's in retrospect.
Mm-hmm.
There's even a view that takes this as an intentional lampoon of the triumph.
Mm-hmm.
That it was this way, well, obviously, because they couldn't have the same kind of triumphal entry as an actual Roman triumph and didn't have the number of people, but also that it was intentionally modest. I mean, could Jesus have commandeered a horse somewhere? Probably.
Mm-hmm.
But he didn't.
Mm-hmm.
Could he have gotten a sturdy, large donkey? Sure. But he got a nursing donkey with the colt, remember, trotting along behind,
Mm-hmm.
which gives a very different and intentional feel. So what kind of triumph is this supposed to represent? And what kind of person is the triumphator around whom this triumph is being conducted? And that is, I think, for the time, the central question. Who, what does a Messiah look like? What does it mean? Probably for most of the Jews, it did mean a ruler, like David. The Holy Land was currently, in terms of Palm Sunday, under Roman leadership. Herod the Great, who built the Second Temple and refurbished it and built a huge palace by it, and on and on and on, though it was underneath the view of the Roman fort. So the Romans could look down and see what was going on at the temple. Herod was, aside from a very ambitious and clever person, and rather bloodthirsty, was barely a Jew. In fact, strictly speaking, he wasn't. His father came from, I think was a general in Idumea, an area that had fairly recently been forcibly converted to Judaism. And his mother was an Arab princess, which gave him a pretty good pedigree in terms of local international relations. did not give him a pedigree within Judaism because his mother wasn't Jewish and his father was barely Jewish. He called himself Jewish so that he could rule, so that his rule, his control of the area would have some legitimacy. But things were not good. If you were an observant Jew, you were faced with two major issues. One was cultural, and the other was political. And it all went back to the law. The law which for Jews was God brought into the world. Not incarnation in the sense of flesh, but this was how God spoke, and this is how you were God's people, was observing the law. If everybody stopped observing the law, who would know about God? Who would follow God? Where would God's actions be acknowledged in the world? Nowhere. So not following the law was not a question of, can I eat swordfish? But, can I keep God alive in the world? And the law itself, if you look at the Ten Commandments, which we are about to in level 3, it's stated in the second person, singular. Thou shalt not murder. So for a Jew, it was a personal obligation. You couldn't be passive about it. You couldn't go on automatic. You couldn't say, yeah, well, you know, it's being taken care of by somebody else, not my job. It's thou. And we lose this in English. But if you also look at the collectivity of the Decalogue, and Decalogue simply means 10 words, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew and more accurate. Those sort of constitutional, not legal, but constitutional directives are for the health of the community. So you have, if you are a Jew, at that time you have a personal obligation to see not only your behaviors, these are not for your personal well-being, they are for the health of the community and the manifestation of God in the world. So what do you do in a world that, culturally speaking, is Hellenistic and goes against quite a few of your practices, and at the same time is being ruled by Rome, which, under Pontius Pilate in particular, prohibited you from actively pursuing what you want to do under the law. And this has been going on for several hundred years. And people are thinking, and this resonates with me currently a great deal, how could it be any worse? And lo and behold,
It gets worse.
it gets worse. You go from Herod to Pontius Pilate. There's not even the effective intermediary after Herod dies. I mean, there are nominal ones, but it's Rome that's peering down at the temple, that's appointing the high priest, which is against the law. And there has been this problem in one way or another, just getting worse every year, for a couple of hundred years now. What can you do? Remember, the obligation is on you for the health of the community, and the community is not healthy. People want to be modern. So they want to be Hellenistic. It's more fun. And people really don't, a lot of people really don't want war with Rome because they're going to lose. At the same token, this has got to stop. So you have one view of the Messiah as a king who will come in and somehow stop this and rule over the land of Israel that follows the law and follows God's word. You also have groups who don't see it quite that literally because they think the end of time has to happen because if this continues, God will be lost to the world. And remember, it's your responsibility to see that God is manifest in the world by your actions and by keeping your community strong. So history has got to stop because look at where it's going, and if it continues at this rate, they will not be able to recapture. There will be so few Jews left. God will not be heard, God will not be seen. So history's got to end. It's got to end, so it's going to be something more cosmic than just a holy kingdom. And there were a lot of messiahs. There's an interesting, but flawed, of course, book called Zealot by Reza Aslan, which is really interesting. It talks about all the other messiahs that were popping up right and left and what happened to them. Though I challenge any one of you to give me the name of, I've read the book and I can't remember the name of any other one, but so there were lots of messiahs. They were obviously not very successful. So Jesus, with this awareness, comes to Jerusalem, which is ruled directly by Rome, and which is the center of the temple cult, which, needless to say, is very Hellenistic, gone away from the old-time religion. The high priest is not chosen according to the law. The Sanhedrin, the Sadducees, which is the priestly group, is therefore has direct ties with Rome. Of course, one of the reasons is they want to pacify Rome because they know perfectly well, one, they would lose their power but even more importantly, Rome would win. Were they wrong? No. In 70 AD, you had the first Jewish revolt. And the temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was practically burnt to the ground. And the Jews were exiled. They weren't wrong. What they feared happened. The Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees have gotten a bad rap. And there are even theories, which I kind of hold to, that Jesus was a Pharisee. And but there were two groups. There was one that wanted to follow the law by the letter, and another group that looked at the principles of the law, and the letter should follow the principles. So if you read Rabbi Hillel, who spouts things like the Golden Rule before Jesus, and a whole lot of other, you see a very similar universal view of God and the law. And there were God-fearers who respected that and respected the religion, who were not Jews, who would attend synagogues. But to become a Jew was a bit much for a variety of reasons. So it's in this world of desperation, fear, oppression, economic oppression, because there was an increasing gap between the wealthy and the poor farmers especially. This was the world that the triumphal entry into Jerusalem took place. So what did Jesus and his followers think was going on? Were they probably all agreed? Well, if you look at the Gospels, no. They weren't. Yet here you have a conscious choice of symbols. And the symbols essentially were ones of poverty and peace. Not might, not the fancy temple, but a very noticeable contrast to what was an expected triumphant entry. But it introduces the question of, okay, what is the triumph? And who is the king? And what kind of king do we get in the end?
Wonderful, thank you. So that's the
Started out
historian.
soft, but then
This is the historian speaking, so now the worship leader, the liturgist is speaking. So how, did you all grow up in the church? You remember Palm Sunday before the new prayer book?
I remember Palm Sunday as a Catholic.
Okay.
And Ash Wednesday.
Yeah, okay. Well, Palm Sunday is in the new prayer book, has a different title. It's called Passion Sunday / Palm Sunday. So we've taken, and this was it's really interesting. Palm Sunday, it used to be you'd go to church on Sunday morning and go to the Mass, and then you'd come back in the afternoon for a procession. And in Jerusalem, they had they would have massive processions down from up on the Mount of Olives down into through the Garden of Gethsemane into, and we're talking very early. We're talking, as you said, 4th century, down to the tomb of Jesus, which is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now. So I'm going to skip forward a long ways. What we know about how people celebrated this Palm Sunday in the Middle Ages, in the 11th and 12th century, comes from what's called the Sarum Rite, and Sarum is just Latin for Salisbury, so it's what they did at Salisbury Cathedral, the old one, not the one we know now, but there's a ruins from the old one, and so what they did, and the Sarum Rite in England was what was existing at the time of the English Reformation, the time of Henry VIII and Cranmer, and the elaborate processions that were part of Palm Sunday were very elaborate, and they had they start out with a blessing and moving around. You kind of implied that. Moving around, they had different stations, and they chant different things, and very elaborate. When Cranmer took it over, there were first off, they didn't like to bless anything except water and wine and people in the Reformation, and so blessing these things like palms wasn't a big deal. It wasn't in the prayer book. There was nothing for special holy days in the 1549 prayer book. Or in the subsequent prayer books. So, but there's lots of local usage in England and then in this country about how people would do the Liturgy of the Palms. But from the experience of a parish priest, what happens is you go from Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and we sing things like Glory, Laud, and Honor. That was that was in the Sarum Rite. Sing Glory, Laud, and Honor, and we've got all these palms, and we're, yay, Jesus has come, wonderful, wonderful. And then the next Sunday is Easter Sunday. And nobody goes through Good Friday. Nobody gets how ironic this triumphal entry, which, in all the movies, they've got, everybody's watching, and I remember going to Israel, going on a walk through the Stations of the Cross, and as we entered Jerusalem, nobody was paying attention to us. I mean, I think that's what it was like. Nobody's paying attention to this guy on a donkey except the people that are with him. But in all the movies, everybody stops and is watching and throwing insults and all, whatever they're doing. Anyway, so what the new prayer book did, this is one of the profound changes in 1979, is that we have Holy Week. We have Ash Wednesday, and then we have Holy Week. And Palm Sunday begins Holy Week, not because it's the triumphal entry, although that's the entry into Jerusalem, but because we read the Passion. So we've got, and people complain about this. I have heard complaints, and there's lots of different ways of reading it. In the Sarum Rite, they had, people would chant it. There would be three people, the narrator, Jesus, and somebody else, and they chant the whole Matthew's Passion narrative. Each year we read the Passion narrative in some way, every Palm Sunday. This year it'll be Matthew, it'll be Mark, and Luke. So what do you think about, you go do this liturgy of the Palms. It's a big service. It's kind of like Maundy Thursday. I mean, not Maundy Thursday, it's kind of like the vigil. It's everything. So you do this big procession, going around the streets of the city. Sometimes parishes joining together doing it. Whatever, you do this big procession, sing all the glory, laud, and honor, and then suddenly you stopped. And then there's two readings. There's the Philippians and Psalm 22, a few verses, and then the Passion narrative. And it's one of those, it's one of those services where you feel the tension of that question. You really experience it, I think, in a way. And it's one of the great gifts of the prayer book, which came out of 100 years of church reform. 100 years of the revival of liturgy and the study of liturgy. Has really enriched the church in a way that it's hard to imagine. And I think I guess what I want to say is one of the ways it's enriched our life is by giving us Holy Week back, which both Palm Sunday and then Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and the Easter Vigil and then Easter morning. So is there anything else I wanted to say? I don't think so. That's enough.
Can I?
And I'd be interested in your reflections. Between the Palm Sundays you once knew and the Palm Sunday we have now. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say we've switched it around a little bit, and we're reading the Passion Gospel at the very end of the service. We've done that, I think, at least 2 years.
Yep.
So the experience there is a little different, and it's almost like the service itself descends, to the point where we leave then in silence with no dismissal and no closing hymn.
Yeah.
And I think that really sets the tone. I mean, it's a little different. You don't experience the tension in quite the same way, maybe, but I think having the two ends, we start out, yay, and then we kind of end out, and I think it really does prepare people for Easter.
Yeah.
And we walk, the whole of Holy Week we walk with Jesus through his passion. So you might say, oh, you skipped Maundy Thursday and all that, but we really we're preparing ourselves for what we're about to experience through the liturgy.
Well, and the tradition is to read Matthew on Palm Sunday, and then Mark and Luke in during the week, and then John on Good Friday. So you hear the Passion.
The full Passion.
The Passion narrative. The Gospels really are, somebody described the Gospel books as Passion narratives with extended introductions, because that's how they started. It started with, the Passion narrative was the first thing that was written down, so it's one of the reasons that Holy Week becomes so important is because it really is we get the whole story in its birth. Anyway, and I think it's wonderful that we have liturgists that are experimenting with how we do it. I mean, But I just wanted to point out that Palm Sunday, how we used to experience it, is quite different than how we experience it now.
Just a little aside though, Palm Sunday is not the only way that Passion Sunday has been named. In fact, in England, it was often called Y-E-W, Sunday. And in places in Europe, it's called the
YEW
equivalent
is
of
like
flowering
a shrub.
Sunday, because they didn't have palms.
It's an evergreen.
Oh, it's a different tree.
So they
Got it, got it.
use
It's like a
Right.
brush, it's
So they
like a
had-
shrub.
Yeah, yeah, whatever branches you
Whatever
have.
branches you had, it
makes
was
total
Palm Sunday.
And the yew tree is a holy tree.
Yeah.
The yew tree, they live for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They're very old, and so that they would use yew.
Beautiful.
And some places in Europe, it's flowers.
Yeah.
In various
So
ways.
then the imagery is the same, the symbolism both of life and of kind of victory and celebration. Yeah, interesting.
But do any of you, have you experienced that? Do you remember the first time you heard the Passion on a Palm Sunday, and was it a, you know? No, okay.
I'll only share one little recent remembrance. We were in Spain, Santiago de Compostela, on Palm Sunday 5 or 6 years ago. And we were there the preceding week too, and a couple other, Segovia and Salamanca. They were a lot of preparation for Palm Sunday, but there was a huge, big celebration in the plaza in Santiago that Palm Sunday, with big figures, accentuated, figurines, people proceeding through the plaza and up to the cathedral and stuff like that. I mean, it was anything but what I expected it to be. I mean, I was expecting a much more sobering event, but it was really a celebration. I mean, it was quite a celebration.
Well, it reminds me of Good Friday in Antigua, Guatemala, when the streets are covered in flowers, and statues are covered in flowers, and they process, and there's this, and this is on Good Friday, which is the highest holy day in Latin America, is Good Friday, because they really know about
Pretty
suffering.
fair to say, yeah.
They do good parades.
Nobody goes to church on Easter. They go to church on Good Friday. Anyway,
Well, in the Catholic Church, I can't remember not going to church since I was very young. But we got the palms, and I don't remember much. I do remember the Passion reading, but here at Grace, it's done in such a way. Oh, it just gets you right down deep. But then nothing else happened until Good Friday. And I remember we got the 3 hours from noon to 3 off school. My father got it off from work, and if you were a Catholic, you were there. And it was recognized in the community. But also everybody I knew went to some kind of church. Everyone up through high school. I would go Saturday mornings and go to catechism taught by the nuns, and I didn't see it as missing out on sports or anything. It was just a part of you. And there was no vigil on Saturday, I don't remember, but Easter, it was always in the morning. We always had Easter service, so that's why I'm glad it's back.
We did that walk down from the Mount of Olives
yeah, I did that.
Yeah, we did too.
years ago. That
Yeah.
was